Thank you to the donors for supporting the channel. The link to my Ko-fi is in the description below. I've always loved stories, but I haven't always been a strong reader. Part of the reason why I'm an avid reader now is that in my early 20s, I literally willed myself to be, and it's the best decision I've ever made. But compare my current reading habits, as showcased on my Instagram, to my reading habits when I was in middle school, high school, and the first bit of college, and it's a very different story. In middle school, I struggled with reading. I liked the idea of reading because it's what all of the cool, deep, smart people did, but when it actually came down to sitting with a book, it was a slog. Maybe my attention span wasn't good enough, or maybe I had a hard time reading fast enough to keep up with my interest. But whatever the case was, I would often get bored and put the book down to finish at another time that would never arrive. For example, when I was in 6th grade, I was reading the Martian Chronicles for class, and while I was reading it at my own pace, kind of slowly, I was enjoying it. But as the deadline got closer, I started to panic. I would skim pages, I would skip paragraphs, I'd skip whole pages. I was trying to get through the book on time, and in the process, I really wasn't reading at all. Now, sometime near when the deadline was approaching, my mom asked me an offhanded question about the book, some aspect that she thought was interesting and wanted to hear what I had to say about it. And I had not even read the chapter she was referring to. I was trying to get through the book so fast, I just wasn't absorbing any of it. That day, while I was in school, my mom went to the library and she got me the book on tape. For the children in the audience, that's what we called audiobooks when they were literally on tape. I digress. Listening to those cassette tapes that afternoon and that evening, I was able to finish the book with the best reading comprehension of my life, and I was able to finish the project with just a little extension. Audiobooks have been and continue to be an important part of my reading habit. Yet in the year of our Lord 2023, they remain somewhat controversial. Now I realize that there are people out there who just can't do audiobooks. That's fine. I'm not saying anybody has to. And there are people like me who have listened to audiobooks for decades who don't need this video. That's cool too. In fact, the only people who aren't cool are the ones who sneeringly look down on people who enjoy audiobooks. Shame on them. How dare they try to make someone feel badly for wanting to listen to a story? This video isn't for them either. It's for anybody who's been brain poisoned against audiobooks by this group. People who've been made to feel like it's somehow inferior to read with your ears rather than with your eyes. This video builds my case for why audiobooks are a legitimate way to engage with literature for anybody who's been made to feel they need one. So let's start off with part 1, the case for audiobooks. In the introduction, I told the story of how listening to the Martian Chronicles helped me access the story better than I could while reading it. This personal anecdote is backed up by some interesting cognitive science. People who read and people who listen to audiobooks engage with that literature in the exact same way. The same parts of their brains are activated, they imagine the same, and they feel the same. In fact, secondary schools are introducing audiobooks as an option for their students for the exact same reason that I listened to audiobooks while I was in school. Students are able to engage with literature when they're able to access it. You might think that I started listening to audiobooks for all my assignments after this, but for whatever reason, I didn't do this again, at least not for school. I'm guessing this had to do with a couple of different things. Back in 2006, the library didn't have digital downloadable content the way it does now. You got CDs if you were lucky, and there was a decent chance you were going to have to take out the cassette player. What this meant was that my library card was only good for the books and audiobooks that could fit physically on the library shelf. Then there's the fact that most audiobooks hadn't been recorded yet. This graph shows the number of audiobooks that have been recorded in the last 15 years. And to be clear, this is the number of audiobooks that have been recorded every year, not the total number of audiobooks that there are each year. Every year, more audiobooks get recorded, and every year, audiobooks become more popular. So it's very possible that the books that I was reading for school just hadn't been recorded yet, and if I got unlucky a few times in a row, I probably just stopped checking, because it's not that I couldn't read, it's just that I preferred to listen to audiobooks. It wasn't until my junior year of college, about halfway along this graph, that I did this again. I was taking a class in hero literature and I had to read The Lord of the Rings. And I wasn't having trouble reading it. I actually really enjoyed that book. It was one of the few that every line basically felt like I could pull it as a quote. It was just beautifully written. It was just that I had so many things to do that I couldn't keep up with the pace that I would need to have in order to be finished with the book on time. And while I can't read a physical book while I'm cooking, I can listen to an audiobook while I'm cooking. And that's how I downloaded Audible. They were doing a promotion, 1 free audiobook when you sign up, and I was like, I know which one. So I listened to it like I had with the Martian Chronicles 9 years earlier. I finished in a day and I showed up to class ready for the discussion. And actually the essay I wrote for that class was pretty good. It's probably the best essay I ever wrote for school, and it's part of why I think that audiobooks are so legitimate and worthy. It's not a matter of making material easier, it's a matter of making it accessible. These thoughts were shared by Huey P. Newton, one of the founders of the Black Panther Party, in his book Revolutionary Suicide, in which he writes, "When my brother and I analyzed and interpreted poetry, we were dealing in concepts. Even though I could not read, I was becoming familiar with conceptual abstractions and the analysis of ideas, and beginning to develop the questioning attitude that later allowed me to analyze my experiences. That led, in turn, to the desire to read, and the books I read eventually changed my life profoundly." Like Newton, there are lots of students today who struggle with reading, either because they haven't gotten enough practice, or because they haven't found the supports they need to get good at it, or because they don't see the point in it. None of these have anything to do with how smart you are or your ability to think. That is to say, if the end goal is to have students think about the literature that they're consuming, then audiobooks really should be regarded as just as legitimate as reading as a way to consume the literature. But it isn't always as simple as audiobooks versus text, and that brings us to part 2, the blurry line. So far in this video, I've argued that audiobooks are just as good as reading books. But I think that this binary comparison ignores the fact that there aren't just 2 options. Literature isn't just about books versus audiobooks, and after a bit of brainstorming, I came up with 14 activities that have something to do with reading. I then asked my friends and acquaintances to rank these activities based on how reading-y they felt to them. Based on the results of the survey, I have ranked the 14 activities from least reading-y to most reading-y and pulled comments where applicable. Starting off at number 14, the least reading-y thing out of all of these activities is attending a community theater production of Timon of Athens. The people I asked rated this just 23% reading-y. I put this one on the list because what is a play but an audiobook recited to you by a dozen different people live? And some of the comments I received reflected this as well. I hadn't ever considered a play as a reading activity, but holy cow is it similar to an audiobook. Although it's still engaging with texts, it's very easy to go smooth brain and not actually think about what's being performed. It made me think of the performances I've seen in English and Spanish and in opera and Italian. And I do consider those plays as being on my having read list because I experienced them. Number 13 is just one little step up, somebody listening to an original production of Henry V. The reason I put this one on the list, in addition to Timon of Athens, is that back in Shakespeare's day, people thought differently about the plays that they listened to. They didn't watch a play, they heard a play. And they definitely didn't read a play. I was curious if this distinction would change how people engage with the question. And it did. My respondents rated this, on average, 50% more reading-y than going to a contemporary Shakespeare play, presumably because back then the emphasis was on the audio rather than the visual. Number 12 is very similar, going to see a live recitation of the Iliad. This activity further blurs the line between literature and performance art. The Iliad one was interesting to me because that is, of course, how the Iliad would initially have been consumed. But I suppose I landed the conclusion that, though it may be more authentic, it's not reading. I find this interesting because while it is true, It's not any more true for the Iliad than it is for the Shakespeare examples, which my respondents rated much lower on average. At number 11, we have an author recording a video of themselves reading the first chapter of their book and uploading that chapter to YouTube. This example comes from a video that John Green released before The Fault in Our Stars came out. Lo and behold, one of the comments voices what I thought at the time. The author readings made me think about how that differs from an audiobook or a parent reading a story aloud. I ranked it lower because it's only a partial section of the book as a whole, but I think if the author read the entire text, I would feel differently. Because back then, I didn't watch the video. I just waited for it to come out and then read it over the course of 3 days. The big difference I see between this format and the ones we've seen so far is that this is the first one that you can pause if you want to think and mull over things, if you want to. Number 10, you watch a performance of MacBeth in Polish and you read the subtitles. I did expect this play to rank a little bit higher than the others based on the fact that there is so much reading in the consumption of this medium. Number 9, as a kid, somebody reads you a story and you're not looking at the page. This is the first example that has a physical book in the same room as you. When I was a kid, my teachers would often have reading time, even up through middle school. It may have even been the first time that I practiced something that's part of my reading practice now, where I find an author that I really like, either from word of mouth or from a listicle or something like that, and then I go out and I read more by that author. So while it wasn't a direct reading activity, it was definitely more of a reading activity than not a reading activity, and we're definitely in over 50% territory now. Number 8, you listen to an audiobook in your car on your commute. I never count an audio experience as reading. Reading requires reading. Listening to someone else read is listening. And those audiobooks are often edited versions of the original works by the author, so not even close to reading, I'm sorry to say. This comment prompted me to do a little research into the audiobook industry because it sounded wrong, but often things that sound wrong are true. This just happened to not be one of those cases. 96.3% of all audiobooks are unabridged and unaltered, which is of course the vast majority, with just a few kinds of books still getting abridged releases. Now, I don't know who this was because my survey was completely anonymous, so I'm not putting anybody on blast, but for the sake of demonstration, this reasoning is obviously faulty because it was based on misinformation. Besides, as I've already mentioned, the cognitive science shows that listening is in fact very close to reading. Number 7, we're in the top half now, is you go to an author event and they read out loud the second chapter of their book. This example is also taken from John Green. When I went to his author event, I listened to him read the second chapter, and then when I went home, I read the first chapter, skipped the second chapter because I already knew what happened, and went right on to the third. I find it interesting that this example was rated so much higher than the video example since, as somebody else pointed out, in a live performance you can't pause, whereas with a video or a book or an audiobook you can hit pause. So maybe different people have different criteria for what makes an experience reading-y, or maybe people don't know what they prefer quite as well as they think they do. Either way, 55%, 60% is a pretty slim margin, and my sample size wasn't big enough for us to really worry about that. Number 6 is you're on a bus reading, but it's loud and distracting and you've got an ear out for your stop. We are in the big leagues now. People rated this activity on average as 79% reading-y, which does challenge the dichotomy between something being a reading activity and not being a reading activity. Number 5, you're a child and you're reading along as a grown-up reads to you. This is one of the best ways to learn how to read, especially since if you have a question, you can just ask your grown-up. Number 4 is the one I was most curious about. You and a friend take turns reading chapters of a book to each other. I wasn't sure how this one was going to land, but it looks like most people consider this to be solidly a reading activity. Number 3, reading along with an audiobook. When I made this questionnaire, I went through and ranked all of the options from most reading-y to the least, and this was actually number 1 for me. When I listen to an audiobook, I'm comfortable with about 2 times speed. When I read a book, I'm at about 2.5 times speed, give or take, but when I put the two together, I can go so fast. I'm at like 3 times speed when I do it that way. So from the point of view of reading the most, the fastest, with the greatest comprehension, this is the most reading-y it gets. But the people have spoken. We still have 2 more to go. Number 2 is you reading aloud to a child. I thought that this one might prompt some interesting conversation about reading below your reading level. For me, reading is reading, but I still felt some kind of way about posting on Instagram about reading Babushka Baba Yaga. I mean, I did read it, but isn't that cheating? Not according to my friends and acquaintances. And finally, number 1, you read a book in silence. That's right, there are no perfect scores. Even reading a book in silence is not 100% reading-y. Now, like I said before, I didn't rank this as my number 1 either. So I went in and checked, and sure enough, the person who ranked this as not 100% reading-y ranked reading to a child a little bit higher than this one. Like they're reading for 2. And the process for reading for someone else is a little bit more involved. You have to make acting choices and character voices, and you've got a little person there who's going to ask you questions, and you're going to ask them questions to make sure that they're getting the most out of the story. And that brings us to part 3, the artistry of audiobooks. This opinion is going to be my most controversial yet, but I want to touch on the idea of audiobooks as performance. There were 2 audiobooks that I've just stopped listening to because they were so poorly read that I just couldn't follow the thread of what was happening. One was War and Peace, the other was Uncle Silas. In both of these cases, the problem was the same. The narrator was clearly an amateur who wasn't entirely confident in the meaning of certain phrases and passages and couldn't read them with the conviction of the meaning that would be necessary to pull a reader along. I might have gotten 2 chapters in before deciding to change tack. For War and Peace, there were lots of different recordings out there, so I found a better one. And for Uncle Silas, which is a bit more obscure, there weren't other recorded options, but I just picked up the book and read it. While I definitely prefer audiobooks to textbooks, I find that somewhere between 1/3 to 2/5 of all of the books that I read are regular textbooks. And that tends to be less if I'm on my feet and I have to go, and it'll be more if I am stuck somewhere and I'm sitting for long periods of time, like on a commute, or while I was working in a library and in a bookstore. It's probably 2/3 the other way. I mean, back then I really only listened to audiobooks while I was driving in the car. I used to think that all of the best audiobooks were read by their authors because they knew how to say all of the words correctly. Neil Gaiman does a really good job with this, and I think that he has done all of his own audiobooks. And it's no surprise that he really gets what the books are about and that he really captures how each book is supposed to feel. But as I've listened to more audiobooks, I'm not 100% sure that's right. For example, I really like Jeremy Irons' Lolita. Similar to with the authors, he probably felt a lot of ownership over the story because he had starred in the movie as the main character around whom the narrative is framed as a confession. I also really enjoyed Simon Vance's The Interview with the Vampire. He does the whole story in this Southern French Creole accent, and then when Louis is telling a story within a story, like he's doing voice characters of other people, like a French person or a British person or something, you get British by way of French Creole. Oh, it's so good. So there's more than one way to make the audio performance of a book awesome. But I also once had an author friend tell me that they were furious with the way that the narrator recorded part of their book. They really didn't like the fact that every time someone listened to the audiobook, they were hearing it the way that the narrator thought it should be said and emphasized, rather than just reading the text and deciding for themselves what that meant. I think this is an interesting critique, but not necessarily a grounded one. Every once in a while, there's a line in an audiobook where my brain goes, that's not how I would have read it. In my brain, I correct the emphasis and then I continue listening to the book. This tells me that there are at least two ways that somebody might read and interpret the sentence, and that they don't necessarily align with what the author intended. And that's just the observable surface level of what's going on. As we read or as we listen, we co-create with the author. They provide the scaffold, but we, in our mind's eye, hang onto that scaffold the things from our own life that seem applicable, the details, a floor plan, a face, that kind of thing. In my mind's eye, every house in Harry Potter has the same basic floor plan of the house that I grew up in. The Dursleys, the Weasleys, and Grimmauld Place all have that same basic American colonial layout. That's not what English houses look like. Like, I'm imagining my mom's kitchen, but more cottagey. That's not what J.K. Rowling described, but that's what comes to mind when I think house, and I'm sure that people in other countries other than England also all have different ideas of what these houses would look like, because that's what they think of when they think house. So do narrators sometimes emphasize words differently than the author would have? Sure, but is it as big of a deal as everybody seems to think that it is? No. Even if they change the emphasis in a way that would impact the meaning? Nope. Because books in and of themselves are just the blueprint. There's no evidence to suggest that the way that I read and interpret the book would be any closer to what the author intended. There's even an argument to be made that my interpretation would not be as faithful as the narrator. For example, Simon Vance can do a Creole accent. I have trouble even imagining what that would sound like, and in my mind, my Louis kind of bounces between like Georgian planter and just a straight, fresh off the boat Frenchman. I have trouble with that, but he's able to supply it. Between the two of these, my personal interpretation versus a narrator's interpretation, there are really only two differences, and they're really closely intertwined. The first is that audiobooks are a lot more observable than whatever mistakes I'm making privately. The author can notice how the narrator says certain things, and if they say things in a way that's different from how the author meant them, I would imagine that that would be quite painful. Second, an audiobook carries a certain authority as an official interpretation of the work. That's quite different from whatever I'm doing in private, in my own head, or in the living room with just my friends or family around me. But whatever interpretations or acting choices the narrators do get canonized, even if it's not quite what the author intended. We're going to change tracks a little bit in part 4. Disability. Earlier in this video, I highlighted a comment by somebody who was antagonistic towards audiobooks. But while their thoughts were educational and informative, especially in deconstruction, they were not emblematic of how most people feel about audiobooks. Most people who answered my questionnaire drew a line between reading and listening, but they did so without judgment or hierarchy. For example, in this comment, a lot of these examples have clear lines between someone actively looking at something with their eyes and trying to / understanding what is there. The rest are listening examples. Either way, knowledge and a story is being perceived. It is just the method of receiving it is different. The phrasing of their definition of what is reading actually brings up another issue that I'd like to bring into central focus. What if you're blind? There seem to be two schools of thought when it comes to blind people and reading. The first is that reading Braille, which is an alphabet on paper, is real reading, whereas listening to an audiobook or a text-to-voice is not reading. This is literally true, and there are benefits to learning spelling and word composition, but it's spiritually dishonest for two reasons. First, Only 10% of blind people actually use Braille, because it makes more sense technologically to use audio recordings. In fact, the first long-playing records were invented to make audiobooks for blind people. If you were blind and you needed something read to you, you could send it in and the records and later cassettes to have somebody read it onto the cassettes and then send it back to you. Second, as we discussed before, people who are listening to a book or listening to a document get exactly the same out of it as if they were reading it, which brings us to the second school of thought, that you can read with your eyes or with your ears. This way of thinking that equates reading with your ears to reading with your eyes has had a huge impact on the way that I see reading. I originally came across this idea while I was doing some research in the Peace Corps Community Archive. One of the volunteers, Gear Wilcox, was blind. Well, he's still blind, but at the time he would write letters to his mom and she'd write back to him, and that's the phrase that they would use, that they were reading and writing letters. What he was actually doing was recording and listening to tapes. This seemed like a very clear choice to me, with a powerful underlying message about the language that we use to discuss accessibility aids, especially if there's a stigma against them. We can make the choice to expand the word reading for people who have a physical disability, like being blind, and we can make the choice to expand the word reading for people who have a learning disability, like dyslexia. The science isn't yet conclusive, but there's every possibility that somebody with dyslexia would be more psychologically and cognitively engaged with an audiobook as compared with a traditional book. Which, to me, yeah, because they can actually access it. Because it's more accessible to them, it would actually be more reading-y for them to listen to an audiobook than for them to sit with a book in front of them. Part 5. Semantics. As I started doing more research into the blind community and into the disabled community more broadly, I found that this kind of phrasing is actually fairly common. Phrases like "see you later" literally just mean goodbye. But anybody who knows me in real life knows that I don't hold people to different standards. I will learn as best as I can. I will play devil's advocate to learn all of the arguments against common wisdom so that when it's my turn to make those arguments and change somebody else's mind, I can. So I gave this considerable attention, especially while working with the Gear Wilcox collection of the Peace Corps Community Archive. What I came up with was that when we talk about reading, we're really talking about two distinct phenomena. First is the literal act of reading, and the second is communication more broadly. The most common model for teaching reading is the simple model, which is decoding plus comprehension. And if you're listening to an audiobook or a conversation or anything like that, that's comprehension alone. And then if you're reading either on text or in Braille, that's decoding. There's actually a great joke from 2.5 Men that illustrates this perfectly.
Do you like to read?
Oh yeah, I love reading.
Oh, great, me too. Read anything good lately?
You mean like books and magazines, not billboards and text messages, right?
Yeah.
Then no. Do menus count?
She's defining reading as a literal activity, and the joke is that nobody does that, even if it is the logical end product of what the reading purists pretend to believe. What we mean when we ask, have you read anything good lately, is, have you come across any ideas or stories that have resonated with you? And it's much more honest to say, yeah, I listened to the Martian Chronicles on Audible, than it is to say, yeah, I read the menu last night. Like I said before, I don't hold different people to different standards. I don't say, well, we'll tell the blind person that audio can be reading, but the rest of us know the truth. No, that sucks. If I'm going to take a blind person at their word that audio is reading with your ears, then I'm not going to humor them. I am going to allow their worldview to have an impact on my own, and I'm going to take them seriously. And that extends to allowing able-bodied students to choose from a variety of accessibility tools. Do accessibility tools make it too easy for them to read? Great, we have just identified a bottleneck. Now let's work on the bottleneck, but we can also surpass it and start teaching them more advanced skills. Often, especially early on in reading, there's going to be a disconnect so that you're decoding at one level and you're comprehending at another level. So if reading to the class or audiobooks are a way to let the student access more difficult materials and to really work on their comprehension skills, then they should do that. Students are often ready to take on more, and while we need to address bottlenecks, sure, the bottlenecks should not get in the way of their progressed education in the areas where they are ready to continue. Part 6, a good reader versus a good listener. Before I trained as a teacher, I trained as a historian. That degree changed the way I think about a lot of different things, and perhaps most profoundly, the oral history class changed the way that I think about reading and listening. I could and probably should make a whole video about oral history, but the down and dirty is that somebody sits down with a trained oral historian and they're asked questions about the story of their life or the story of their career or the story of an event they witnessed, and they co-create the story together. An oral history interview style differs somewhat from a journalistic interview style, but the general framework is still there. You have a set of questions you want to ask, and you can throw in follow-up questions as the person tells their story. Sometimes oral histories will be video recorded, but they are at the very least audio recorded, and then there will also be a transcript. Now, even though there are plenty of guidelines in place to preserve as much information from the interview as possible, there are always going to be things that can't be put into text. There's orality, there are movements. Even if you jot down a note, like they make this gesture about this big, you just say about 15 inches. You lose something when you can't hear or see what happened in that interview. And the reverse is also true. You can watch somebody do their interview and it'll take 1 minute per minute, but you can read about 3 times faster than you can watch. So a lot of times people will read or skim the transcript and then they'll go and watch the interview. Both of these are considered to be the interview. They're both considered to be the primary resource. Seeing as, depending on the kind of project this historian might be working on, they might be working with either the video or audio recording or with the text transcript, I've come to the conclusion that listening and reading are exactly the same skill. And now, as I've said so many times on this channel, history is facts plus interpretation. The thing that the historian creates is not 100% what happened. There will be a so what, and there might be a framing mechanism, there might be added details, there might be a juxtaposition. There are so many things that a historian can add in order to create meaning, in order to create that so what for their readers. So what a historian creates is not the one-for-one what somebody telling you their story would say. But it is literally their job to make sure that all their facts are correct and that everything is accurate. One of the most important skills that I learned as a historian is to observe what is in front of you and to draw conclusions based on what the artifacts are telling you. You have to be a really good listener in order to be a historian, and I use that word even when I'm working with text-based documents. For the same reason that the blind community would say, "See you later," because it feels spiritually honest, I feel like when I'm really in text comprehension mode, I feel like I'm listening even if I'm reading. Listeners finish by saying, "Okay, I think I understand you better," which is what I want to communicate about how I approach sources, no matter what kind. Conclusion. Why we read. I began this video by saying that I love books. I get an immense amount of joy from reading them, whether I'm reading fiction and the author has taken me on some adventure into somebody else's life and I'm here for this story, or if it's nonfiction and they're trying to convince me about a worldview they have and of why that worldview matters. But I didn't start out this way. I probably read 10 books for pleasure in all of high school, and it wasn't until I was like 20 that I started turning this around. I picked up a book called Mermaid, which was a retelling of The Little Mermaid, and it was starting to look like it would be just another book that I liked the idea of reading, but that ended up dusty on my shelf. But then at the beach that summer, I read it, and I really liked it. And it took me a while to get into another book, but a year later I read The Hunger Games. And that was the first book where I didn't bother with the movie because I'd already read the book and knew how it ended. I read Carmilla and struggled with the interview with the vampire. In the winter I turned 22, I read The Martian, not to be confused with The Martian Chronicles, and a whole bunch of Sarah Waters books, and I made a decision. I was going to be a reader. I got a job at the comic book store, and then at the regular bookstore, and then at a library, and I made a point of reading. The classes that I took sharpened my appreciation for everything from genre fiction up to the finer points of argumentation, and by the end of the decade I was reading scholarly publications and literary classics for fun, and I am so insanely proud of the person that I've become. When people see how much I read, and I always have a stack of books in my house, and what's more intimidating is that that's the red stack. When people see how much I read, they often say that they should read more but they don't have the time, or they should read more but they're out of practice. But when I hear the should, the first thing I think is that reading for pleasure should be a pleasure. There should be no should. In an ideal world, there is no should. If they're saying should, they're never going to authentically connect with their reading practice. I also tell them to get their stories from however they need to get them, whether that's videos or podcasts or letters or geological surveys, or even video games have some really compelling stories. Because what's really at the core of reading is listening and critical thinking. That's why books are banned. That's why women and slaves have been historically forbidden to read. It's not because print is inherently revolutionary, it's because critical thinking is inherently revolutionary. Critical thinking develops when you read, but reading is not the only way to develop critical thinking. For example, a lot of ministers have been forbidden to preach because their sermons were getting a little too thought-provoking. And historically, that's why sermons were done in Latin, so the masses wouldn't think. And if audiobooks are that thing, then that's it. Have a good day!